Hi everybody, this is Matthew Poes with Poes Acoustics, and Samuel Orff has asked another question, so thanks Sam. I've heard you and Anthony mention that challenges associated with diffusion and smaller room dimensions. With what dimensions or distances to treatment should one take extra considerations, and what should they do differently? So that's a good question. If it's a straight absorber, there's no, I'm going to call it a critical distance. There's no critical distance. You could have your head against it. Now, here's what I will say. Absorbers have a lower end limit that's defined by their depth. So we often talk about if you have to do something like stick your seats right up against a wall so that you're less than a meter, it's really probably going to be best not to have slat panels, perforated panels, binary panels, or diffusers. Excuse me, you're probably going to be best off having a proper absorber. So that just means straight absorption, foam, mineral wool, fiberglass, doesn't matter. That's what should be there. But even more true, the closer you are to it, the thicker you probably want it to be to widen the bandwidth. Now, having said that, I don't know that you need to go any more than 6 inches. I think any more than 6 inches actually starts to run into other issues. You could, if you know what you're doing with absorption, there could be value in that, but more than likely not necessary. There are some hybrid panel approaches that I like that you could use really close to your head, where you've got basically, for the sake of argument, 4 inches of absorption, a membrane, and 2 inches of absorption. They're put together in a certain way, and then the whole thing gets, wrapped in fabric. That actually has nice extended low frequency response to it, while still offering good mid-high frequency absorption. So that could be an option, something like that. But what I wouldn't do are any of those other panels I mentioned to you. So we'll get into why in a second. Now, diffusers are, I think, the most complicated to deal with. So what's happening is sound is hitting the diffuser surface. We'll use this because it's got bumps. So it's a cup holder from OXO. It's our diffuser. So the sound is hitting this diffuser. And when it hits that, if it was just like my hand, let's say my hand is the wall, then it's going to reflect off of it like a flashlight off of a mirror. But when it hits this, it's going to hit it like a flashlight off of a frosted glass. So yes, it's going to reflect off, but actually the light's going to get scattered. The sound in this case is going to get scattered. So the texture is what causes the scattering. Now, any texture will cause scattering of the sound. So it doesn't matter what the texture looks like to cause some amount of scattering. But what happens is when you have a really consistent texture, so slat panels or something that's got a pattern in it where it's got a repeating pattern, the big problem with those repeating patterns with common depth and common width and common shape to it is that the phase then of the scattered sound is still the same. And so you haven't shifted the phase, and you don't really get what we call phase mixing happening out here. So the sound, yes, the sound doesn't hit this and come straight off of it at this an angle of incidence. So it doesn't come off at the angle of incidence anymore. It actually gets broken up and it spreads the sound out into smaller sound energy bits. But if you were to go and sample those sound energy bits, they would all be the same, basically, or very close to the same. Now, if you put a proper diffusing pattern on here, not only does it get scattered, but the phase gets shifted. And it effectively gets randomly shifted, meaning that if you were to sample in space at a certain distance all the different little pieces of sound that got shot off somewhere else, you would find that the phase is different for each one. And it would be hard to find a pattern within that. And so at a certain point, what happens is that the sound, the sound doesn't just like go here and then here. You've got sound going like this and like this. And so if you get to a certain point in space around this diffuser, you get phase mixing where effectively you've got different phases all mixed together in space. So if you're closer to it than that point in space where the phase mixes together randomly, then your ear could actually detect specific, we'll call it beams of sound, with specific phase to them. And it would actually cause a phasiness, because this ear would hear something different from this ear. So it's just like if the speakers are out of phase. And it would be very disconcerting. And it doesn't do what diffusion is supposed to do. It doesn't make the room sound wider or bigger or deeper. It just makes it sound weird. So the point in space where you transition from that problem to that point of random phase mixing is called the critical distance. And the critical distance is defined by the depth and shape and size of the pattern. So most diffusers, even 2-inch diffusers from companies that make like standard QRDs and things like that, typically have a critical distance of a couple of feet or more. And the deeper the diffuser is and the wider its bandwidth, the farther out the critical distance is. There's actually some QRDs out there that are in excess of 12 inches deep where the critical distance is like more than a meter. And so the problem is, for most people in a home theater, sticking something that's that wide of a bandwidth of diffuser on a wall that has such a far out critical distance creates a problem for you. And the problem is simply that you're not going to be able to sit in every seat farther enough away to avoid sitting before the critical distance and in that area of phasiness. And so that's not going to be good. So this is where we get into using specialized devices that have wide bandwidth, but a very short critical distance. And there are various products that are better for that. The barrel-shaped diffusers actually have a relatively short critical distance. They do actually create phase mixing in front of them, and they're extremely effective at scattering in the horizontal axis if the arc is this way. So if you have your diffuser and the arc is like this, I don't know if you can see what I'm doing, but see. So if the arc's like that, this kind of a device scatters this way really well. So the sound goes out, but this way it does not. This way it's going to be still coherent. Now, if you flip it this way, now it's going to scatter really well in this direction, the vertical, but not well in the horizontal. And so with that kind of a device, you can sit relatively close to them. It's not a very sophisticated diffuser, and so it's still not the best option, but they work surprisingly well. The next step up, that gets into things like the good panel that I talk a lot about. So there's a reason why I talk about these. There's a reason why I use them, and that's that they are fairly unique. If you took it, they're about 2 inches. If you took a 2-inch QRD, the critical distance would still probably be about 1 to 2 feet. If you take a 2-inch good panel, 6 inches is probably adequate, and you're fine. So it's got a very short critical distance, and it's got a wider bandwidth than the QRD would. It's actually much, much wider, and better overall diffusion. And there really isn't competition for it. I'll just say I'm still looking for that alternative to it for other, because it's nice to have different options for different purposes. Like I'd like to have something that's maybe not as good at one aspect of diffusion, but it's better at another than that is. The only thing that's not great at is low frequency diffusion. And there's other products that do that better. But as it stands, it's a really, really good diffuser for that purpose because it's got such a short critical distance. It is a 1D diffuser in its standard approach. There is a 2D version, or in Anthony Gramani speak, a 3D version. So I guess that's a limitation, you could say. So then you have slat panels and micro. Okay, so there's also these binary, what are they called? Bad panels, binary amplitude diffusers. And they're not diffusers really, at very high frequencies, like well above 5 to 10 kilohertz, actually really above 10 kilohertz. They actually are pretty effective diffusers, but below that, they're not. And the problem is we hear spaciousness and envelopment in a room, not from diffusion of the plus 10 kilohertz stuff. I'm not going to say there's no value in that. There probably is, but I also kind of question if you need a special diffuser for that purpose. Where the most critical area for getting that sense of spaciousness and envelopment from diffusion tends to actually be in the mid-range area between around 1 kilohertz and 5 kilohertz. So that's the critical band, if you will, where you want the most effective diffusion. Now, below that is actually also, and maybe even more so, important to our perception of envelopment and spaciousness. Low frequencies play a critical role. So between around 70 or 80 hertz and up to around 1 kilohertz, the phase shifts that happen from reflections give us a sense of that. And so stereo bass, if you will, if we're going to call everything below 1 kilohertz bass, which is a common definition that's used, and then that scenario, good diffusion becomes really critical to having a big spacious environment. The problem is acoustic products don't tend to play a very critical role in doing that. Most of that ends up being in the recording and in the placement of the speakers and subwoofers. And so you get a lot of it even in 2-channel recordings, as long as the recording is done right, which most are not. But as long as the recording is done correctly, you're going to get a lot of that in the recording itself, and then just a stereo pair of speakers produces a good bit of that. really what's critical there, for what it's worth, I did an article on this, is getting rid of mono modes. So there's certain modes that are like medial modes, basically, that are happening here. Those modes tend to take away from our perception of spaciousness and envelopment. So if you can get rid of those, what's left tends to create more spaciousness and envelopment. So anyway, back to those other products. The perforated panels, the bad panels or any of the variations of it, the slat panels, any of those things with pretty patterns on the front, you also don't want to sit too close to those, but they're not going to be as big of an issue as a diffuser is. They're not going to create phasiness. It's just that you're going to have this point in space where you've got hard reflections that are coherent and then absorption all happening near each other. It's not frequency independent, so it's going to absorb more. Like at low frequencies, it tends to absorb more, and at high frequencies, it tends to reflect more. And so the reflections are going to be shifted in their spectral balance. So my recommendation for those is not based on this critical distance relative to their depth or anything. It's actually more to get out of that area where you're going to be hearing a strong reflection off of them. So with those, I'd recommend like a meter. I think a meter, 3 to 3.5 feet in that range is probably the right distance to avoid hearing overly strong reflections. So that's why I wouldn't recommend sticking those directly behind your head. I don't think that's a great idea. It could be over your head, but like directly here at ear level behind your head, I wouldn't do that. On the sidewalls, you could do it. I think it would be okay. But if you've got seats that are closer than a meter to them, I think that could be a problem. Otherwise, they're fine. And we should get into this in another video where we talk about acoustics, but I will say there's real reason to not have just absorption and just diffusion. Having some mixed panels like that, I think, helps to allow you to cover more of the walls, but avoid over-absorbing. And I think there's some value in that. So anyway, I hope that's helpful. I guess I didn't talk about this bass traps. There's no critical distance to a bass trap. You can sit as close as you want to. The only issue is that a lot of bass traps have a solid, hard front surface to them. So if they do, it's no different than sitting next to a wall at that point. It could affect things. But anyway, thanks, Samuel. Good question. Hopefully people found that interesting. Like I've said before with these types of videos, I really appreciate you putting the questions in. I'll try to answer as many as I can, but if you really, really want your question answered, do a super thanks, and that helps to cover the costs of editing these videos and makes me more likely to do it. So thanks again. Appreciate everybody watching the videos.